When you're sewing in a sleeve, sometimes known as setting a sleeve, the goal is to get a nice, smooth sleeve cap seam. That's the one that attaches the sleeve to the garment, without any gathers or puckers showing. That seems impossible because you just gathered that same seam to ease it. But it's not. It has to do with the way you ease the seam. Let's take a closer look. One way to take the guesswork out of easing your seam is to measure the distance between the dots on the armhole and pin mark it on your sleeve board or ironing board. Machine baste a double row of ease stitches. Draw up the bobbin threads, but not more than the amount you want to shrink the sleeve cap. Compare it to your pin marks. If it is still too long, gather more. If it is too short, release some of the gathers. When the length is right, tie knots in the thread tails so the stitching won't stretch. Most sleeves from a commercial pattern will now ease into the armhole without problems. Sew the sleeve seam and the side and shoulder seams on your garment. Some people like to sew the sleeve on before sewing the side and underarm seams because it's easier to sew flat than inside two tubes pinned together. But I've always had slightly better results with the way the sleeve hangs by sewing it in the round. Try both ways and decide which one you like best. Turn the garment right side in and the sleeve right side out. Put the sleeve inside the garment. Here is another place where sewers disagree, to pin or not to pin the sleeve to the armhole. Many people use only 2 pins to secure the sleeve to the garment for installing the sleeve. One at the side seam and one at the shoulder seam. I like to add at least 2 more, one at each dot. But I also like to space out a few across the top to make sure the easing is balanced on each side of the shoulder point. The pins keep the fabric from sliding on the basting threads and bunching while you sew. Once the pins are in place, we're ready to sew. Here again, there are 2 points of view about which layer goes on top. Here's the logic behind both opinions. You decide what works best for you. People who sew with the sleeve on top believe they can better see how each stitch locks into the fabric so they can prevent any puckers or gathers from being created in the eased areas as they sew. To sew with the sleeve on top, just lay it on the sewing machine with the needle and presser foot inside the tube unit and stitch from the side seam all the way around on the seam line until the stitches meet and cross. There are also good reasons for sewing with the garment on top. Doing so puts the long edge on the bottom layer. The bottom layer always travels through the sewing machine slightly faster than the top because of the way the feed dogs grab and move the fabric. This works to your advantage when the bottom layer is slightly longer, but there's yet another advantage. Remember when we talked about fabric's bias grain? I showed you how a bias strip will stretch, but when it does, it gets narrower in the opposite direction. If you stretch it across the width, it gets shorter in length. You can put this principle to work when setting your sleeves. Watch the fabric edges as you sew and feel along the stitch line with your fingertips for ripples. If you see a fullness on the edge or feel one in front of the needle, reach between the fabric layers on the left side of the presser foot with a finger or a pencil eraser while you slide a finger or eraser under the right edge. Apply pressure to both pencils in opposite directions against the machine and away from the seam in the bias areas. This causes the lower seam to temporarily shrink while you sew it without puckers. From there on, it's easy business to attach the sleeve to your garment successfully, but if you do get a pinch of fabric, just open it with your seam ripper, Redistribute the gather or pinch and run that section back through your sewing machine. Sew a final row of stitching under the arm about 1/4 inch into the seam allowance and then trim the seam allowance. You can finish the seam in any manner you prefer, zigzag or serge over the edge, bind it, or simply use pinking shears to keep it from raveling. You see, sewing in a sleeve isn't at all hard. I think sewing two edges that curve in different directions might seem a little intimidating at first, but you just saw how easily everything lines up. Even though they're not difficult, and they're easy to fix if a stitch or two isn't right, I always have a real sense of accomplishment when I sew in a beautiful sleeve. You will too. See you next time.